Welcome back to the Duke's Revenge, where the coldest hearts burn the hottest, and where the most elaborate deceptions are sometimes the purest forms of devotion. I'm so glad you're here with me today for another tale of obsession, betrayal, and the kind of love that watches from the shadows for years before it finally strikes. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you listening from right now? Drop your city and your local time in the comments. I love seeing our community span across continents, all of us drawn together by stories of power, passion, and the dangerous games aristocrats play behind closed doors. Today's story takes us to the grand estates of 1853 England, where a young woman has been sold like chattel to pay her father's gambling debts. Her groom? The Duke of Aldridge, a man society calls the blind Duke, a recluse who hasn't attended a single ball in 7 years. They say a terrible riding accident stole his sight. They say he lives in perpetual darkness, attended only by servants, his magnificent estate, a gilded tomb. They say she'll spend her life as nursemaid to a broken man who cannot even see her face. They pitied her. They laughed behind their fans at her misfortune. One lord in particular, a man who had wanted Evangeline for himself, called her the blind Duke's seeing eye bride at a dinner party, and the entire table erupted in cruel laughter that echoed through London's drawing rooms for weeks. But what no one knows, what not a single whispering tongue in all of England could possibly suspect, is what happens when the bedroom door closes on their wedding night, when the candles flicker low, when the servants withdraw and silence falls like a velvet curtain, when the man they call broken rises from his chair, crosses to where she stands trembling by the window, and looks directly into her eyes with a gaze so intense, so utterly focused, that she cannot draw breath. "I've seen you for years, Evangeline," he whispers, his voice like velvet wrapped around a blade. "Every ball you attended, every garden you walked through, every tear you shed when you thought yourself alone. I've been watching, waiting, and now, finally, you're mine." What had he been doing all those years in his self-imposed exile? Why did he choose her? And what will happen when the man who mocked her discovers that the blind Duke sees everything, including exactly how to destroy his enemies? Let me take you back to that April morning when Evangeline Whitmore first learned she had been sold, when the scent of spring blossoms couldn't mask the bitter truth of her circumstances, and when one woman's nightmare became the beginning of an obsession 7 years in the making. The morning Evangeline Whitmore learned she was to be married, rain streaked down the windows of Witmore Manor like tears on a grieving face. She sat in her father's study, her hands folded in her lap with the practiced stillness of a woman who had learned early that showing emotion only invited exploitation, while Lord Whitmore paced before the fireplace like a fox caught in a trap of his own making. The room smelled of old leather, stale tobacco, and the particular sour-sweet scent of brandy that had become her father's constant companion over the past several years. The fire had burned low in the grate, casting flickering shadows across walls lined with books that had not been opened in a decade, remnants of a time when the Whitmore family had pretended to intellectual pursuits along with their other pretensions. "It is settled," Lord Whitmore announced, not meeting her eyes. His voice carried the defensive belligerence of a man who knows he has done something shameful and has decided to brazen it out rather than admit fault. "The contracts were signed last evening." Evangeline felt the words strike her like physical blows, each one landing with terrible precision against her breastbone. Contracts, signed, settled, as though she were a horse being sold at Tattersall's, a piece of furniture being transferred between estates, a commodity whose only value lay in what could be extracted from her. Under English law in 1853, this was precisely what she was. The great legal fiction of coverture held that upon marriage, a woman's very identity was subsumed into her husband's. Her property became his property, her wages his wages, her body his to command. A father could dispose of his daughter's future as he saw fit, and neither law nor society would question his right to do so. The Matrimonial Causes Act that would grant women even the barest protections was still 4 years distant, a reform that most of Parliament considered dangerously radical. For now, Evangeline was property, and property did not get to choose its owner. "Might I inquire," she asked, her voice steady despite the trembling that had begun somewhere deep in her chest, "the name of my intended husband?" Her father's pacing stopped. He stood with his back to her, shoulders hunched beneath his worn coat. The same coat he had worn for 3 seasons now, because there was no money for a new one, because every spare penny went to the gaming tables where Lord Witmore chased the fortune that forever eluded his grasp. The Duke of Aldridge. The name fell into the silence like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of recognition spreading through Evangeline's memory. The Duke of Aldridge. The blind Duke. The man who had vanished from society 7 years ago after a riding accident that was said to have destroyed his sight. He lived as a recluse in his vast estate in the wild northern reaches of England, attended only by servants who were rumored to be as strange and silent as their master. He had not been seen at a ball, a dinner party, a hunt, or any other social occasion in nearly a decade. The gossip columns had largely forgotten him. He was merely a tragic footnote in the endless chronicle of aristocratic misfortune, a cautionary tale mothers told their sons about the fragility of health and fortune. "Father," Evangeline said slowly, the words feeling strange and heavy on her tongue, "the Duke of Aldridge is blind. A minor inconvenience. Lord Witmore still would not turn to face her. The man has 40,000 a year and an estate that spans 3 counties. His condition is of no consequence to the arrangement." No consequence. Evangeline felt something cold and sharp settle in her stomach, like a shard of ice that would not melt, no matter how she tried to warm herself against it. She was 23 years old, 3 full seasons past the age when most women of her station married, if they married at all. She had watched her 2 younger sisters wed before her, had stood in church pews while they promised their futures to men they at least knew, men whose faces they could see and whose voices they recognized, men who had courted them with flowers and poetry and shy smiles across crowded ballrooms. But this? Sold to a stranger, a recluse, a man whose face she had never glimpsed and whose voice she had never heard. A man who could not even see her if he wished to. "The debts," she said quietly. It was not a question. She had known for years that her father was drowning, had watched the gradual disappearance of the family silver, the dismissal of servants one by one, the increasing shabbiness of the house that had once been her pride. Lord Witmore flinched as though she had struck him. "The debts are substantial. The Duke's offer was generous, more than generous. He has agreed to settle all outstanding obligations and provide an additional sum that will restore this family's position entirely. How much do you owe? That is not your concern." "I believe it is," Evangeline said, and something in her voice made her father finally turn to look at her. "Given that I am apparently the currency being used to pay it." Lord Witmore's face reddened. He was not a bad man, Evangeline thought with the strange clarity that sometimes comes in moments of crisis. He was simply a weak one, weak in the face of temptation, weak in his convictions, weak in his love for a family he would sacrifice, without hesitation, to feed his own addiction. "You will not speak to me in that tone," he blustered, I am your father, and I have made the decision that is best for this family. You will marry the Duke of Aldridge in 3 weeks' time, and you will be grateful for the opportunity to serve your family's interests." Grateful. The word tasted like ashes in her mouth. "And if I refuse?" Her father laughed, a short, ugly sound that held no humor. "Refuse? And do what, precisely? You have no money of your own, no prospects, no skills that would allow you to support yourself independently. You are 23, Evangeline, well past the age when most men are looking for a bride. What exactly do you imagine your alternatives to be? Governess to some merchants, children, companion to a dowager who will work you until you're gray and then turn you out without a pension." Evangeline had no answer, because there was no answer to give. Under the laws that governed English society, she was entirely dependent on her father until such time as she married, at which point she would become entirely dependent on her husband. Women could not own property in their own names, could not enter into contracts, could not even claim legal custody of their own children. She was, in every meaningful sense, a legal nonentity, a ghost who existed only in relation to the men who controlled her fate. "I understand, Father," she said, rising from her chair with the grace that had been drilled into her since childhood. Spine straight, chin level, hands folded at her waist. The perfect picture of aristocratic compliance, even as something inside her cracked and began to bleed. "If you will excuse me, I should begin preparing for my departure." She made it to her bedchamber before the tears came. Even then, she pressed her face into her pillow to muffle the sounds, unwilling to give the servants anything to gossip about. The household would learn soon enough. The maids would whisper to the footmen, who would tell the grooms, who would share the news at the village tavern until all of England knew of her humiliation. "Poor Evangeline Witmore," they would say behind their fans and over their teacups. Sold to the blind Duke to pay her father's gambling debts. Can you imagine? Spending the rest of your life as nursemaid to a man who cannot even see your face? At least she'll never have to worry about her looks. Not that she had much to recommend her in that department anyway. The cruelty of society was something Evangeline had learned to navigate, but she had never before been its primary target. Now she would be. For the rest of her life, she would be the blind Duke's unfortunate bride, the girl who had no other options, the woman whose father had valued her at precisely the sum of his gambling debts. She cried until her throat was raw and her eyes were swollen, until the pillow was soaked with her grief and her anger and her helpless, impotent rage at a world that treated women as chattel to be bought and sold. And then, because there was nothing else to be done, she dried her tears and began to pack. The news of her engagement spread through London society with the devastating speed of a summer wildfire. Within 2 days, Evangeline found herself the subject of whispered conversations at every gathering, the object of pitying glances and cruel speculation. The blind Duke's bride, the girl sold to pay her father's debts, poor, pathetic Evangeline Witmore, traded like livestock at market. She learned to keep her face carefully blank, her emotions locked away behind walls of ice and iron. She learned to smile graciously when matrons offered their condolences with barely concealed satisfaction. She learned to pretend she didn't hear the whispers that followed her through every ballroom, every drawing room, every garden party she was forced to attend in the final weeks before her departure. But no one's reaction cut deeper than Lord Ashton Fairfax's. She encountered him at Lady Pemberton's afternoon tea 3 days after her father's announcement. The drawing room was crowded with society matrons and their daughters, all of them pretending not to stare at Evangeline while hanging on every word of the latest gossip about her unfortunate situation. She had positioned herself near the window, hoping the afternoon light would discourage anyone from approaching her, when a shadow fell across her needlework, and she looked up to find Ashton standing over her with an expression of barely concealed fury. Lord Ashton Fairfax was everything a gentleman should be. Tall, golden-haired, with the kind of classical features that painters loved and poets celebrated. He was heir to the Earl of Thornbury, possessed of a considerable fortune in his own right, and had been paying particular attention to Evangeline for the past 3 seasons. He had danced with her at balls, sent her flowers, called upon her family with appropriate regularity, and treated her with the kind of careful, calibrated attention that society expected from a serious suitor. But no announcement had ever come. Ashton had courted her with exquisite propriety and never once made an actual offer. He had kept her dangling, waiting, hoping, and now, apparently, he was angry that another man had claimed what he had neglected to secure. "So it's true," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You're to marry the blind Duke." Lord Fairfax. Evangeline set down her embroidery, keeping her face carefully neutral. "How kind of you to inquire after my welfare." "This isn't a social call, Evangeline." His handsome face twisted with an emotion that might have been concern but looked more like wounded pride. "I've just heard the most disturbing rumors about your situation. Tell me they're not true. Tell me your father hasn't actually sold you to that reclusive madman." "I'm afraid I cannot tell you that, as it would be a lie." She met his eyes steadily. "The contracts were signed 3 days ago. I am to be married in 3 weeks." "This is absurd." Ashton's voice rose slightly, drawing curious glances from nearby guests. He seemed not to notice, or perhaps not to care. "You cannot seriously intend to marry a man who is blind and mad, who has hidden himself away like some medieval hermit for the better part of a decade. A man no one has seen in 7 years. A man who might be dead for all anyone knows, with servants keeping up the pretense to maintain control of the estate. I was not aware my intentions had anything to do with it. The decision was my father's to make. Your father is a fool and a drunkard." The words came out harsh and clipped, stripped of the careful courtesy that usually governed Ashton's speech. Everyone knows he's gambled away everything the family ever had. But this, selling you to the blind Duke like some Turkish concubine, it's beyond the pale. It's medieval. It is legal," Evangeline interrupted quietly. "And it is done." "It doesn't have to be done." Ashton leaned closer, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "I have connections, Evangeline. Influence. If you asked me to intervene." "To what end, my lord?" She looked at him with something that felt dangerously close to contempt. "You have had 3 seasons to make your intentions known. 3 seasons of dances and flowers and afternoon calls. And in all that time, you never once spoke to my father about a formal arrangement. You never once made an offer." Ashton's face flushed. "I was waiting for the right moment. The right moment has passed." Evangeline gathered her embroidery and rose from her seat, acutely aware of every eye in the room turning toward them. "I'm engaged to the Duke of Aldridge, and in 3 weeks I shall be his wife. Whatever you might have said or done before this point is now irrelevant." She turned to walk away, but Ashton caught her arm, a breach of propriety so severe that several matrons gasped audibly. "He doesn't deserve you," he said, low and fierce. "That blind monster hiding in his crumbling castle, he doesn't know what he's getting. He can't even see you." Evangeline looked down at his hand on her arm, then up at his face. When she spoke, her voice was cold enough to frost glass. "Perhaps that's a mercy. At least I won't have to see disappointment in his eyes when he realizes I'm not worth what he paid for me." She pulled free of his grip and walked away, her spine straight and her head high, while the whispers erupted behind her like a flock of startled birds. That evening, at dinner, she learned just how far the cruelty had spread. Her younger sister Margaret, newly returned from a card party at Lady Hartington's house, could barely contain her glee as she shared the latest gossip. "They're calling you the blind Duke's seeing-eye bride," Margaret announced, helping herself to another portion of roasted pheasant. Lord Hartington himself made the joke at dinner, and everyone laughed for simply ages. Lady Westbrook nearly choked on her wine. "Margaret." Their mother's voice carried a warning note, but it was a weak warning. The Countess of Witmore had never been particularly protective of her eldest daughter, viewing Evangeline's prolonged, unmarried state as a personal embarrassment. "What? I'm only repeating what everyone is saying." Margaret's eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. "They're also wondering whether the Duke will even know what you look like on your wedding night. Perhaps you could describe yourself to him, Evangeline. Tell him you're tolerable looking, in a certain light, if one squints." Evangeline set down her fork carefully. "How fortunate that I'll soon be far away from London and its sophisticated wit. I'm certain the Duke's household will provide far less entertaining conversation." "At least conversation there will be possible," Margaret shot back. "Here, one can barely get a word in edgewise around your constant silence and superior airs. Perhaps that's why Ashton Fairfax never proposed. Even he couldn't stand the tedium of your company." "That's enough." Lord Witmore's voice cut across the table, gruff and uncomfortable. "We'll have no more talk of this situation. What's done is done, and we should all be grateful that a solution has been found." Grateful. That word again, wielded like a weapon against anyone who dared suggest that selling a daughter to pay gambling debts might be less than honorable. Evangeline excused herself from dinner early, claiming a headache that was not entirely fictional. As she climbed the stairs to her bedchamber, she heard Margaret's laughter floating up from the dining room, bright and cruel and utterly without mercy. The blind Duke's seeing-eye bride. She supposed it would be carved on her tombstone. The first letter from the Duke arrived 2 days before her scheduled departure. It came in an envelope of heavy cream paper, thick and expensive, sealed with black wax bearing an unfamiliar crest, a raven perched upon a sword, wings spread as though preparing for flight. The seal was pressed deep into the wax, the impression sharp and clear. Whoever had sent this letter had taken care with it. Evangeline turned the envelope over in her hands, studying it in the gray morning light that filtered through her bedchamber windows. The rain had finally stopped, but the sky remained overcast, as though even the weather could not muster enthusiasm for her impending nuptials. She broke the seal with trembling fingers and unfolded the single sheet within. The handwriting was elegant, but oddly uneven. Sometimes the letters slanted right, sometimes left, as though the writer had been uncertain of their placement on the page. Like a blind man learning to write by feel rather than sight, she thought. Navigating the paper through touch alone, never quite certain where one line ended and another began. The message itself was brief. "You must have questions. I will answer them when you arrive." A no formal greeting, no flowery sentiments about the honor of her acquaintance or the pleasure of their forthcoming union. Just those stark words and a single initial, mysterious and somehow more intimate than any proper salutation could have been. Evangeline read the letter 3 times, searching for hidden meanings, for clues about the man who had written it. She found nothing, just the strange handwriting, the expensive paper, and the lingering scent of something masculine. Sandalwood, perhaps, mixed with ink and something else she couldn't identify. The second letter arrived the following morning. "The journey to Aldridge Park takes 4 days by carriage. I've arranged for frequent stops, so you may rest comfortably. Do not fear the distance. I have waited longer." Wait longer for what? The question haunted her as she supervised the packing of her trunks, as she said goodbye to the servants who had known her since childhood, as she walked through the rooms of Witmore Manor for what might be the last time, waited longer for a wife, for a companion to share his isolated existence, for someone, anyone, to penetrate the darkness of his blindness? The third letter came the night before her departure, delivered by a footman who reported that a special messenger had ridden through the evening rain to ensure it reached her in time. They will tell you I am a monster. They will tell you I am mad. They will tell you many things about the night I lost my sight. Most of them are lies. The truth is far more interesting. Evangeline sat with this letter for a long time, reading it over and over until she had memorized every curve of every letter. The strange handwriting, the cryptic messages, the confidence that bordered on arrogance. Who was this man she was about to marry? What did he want from her? And what truth could possibly be more interesting than the tragic tale society had constructed around his name? She fell asleep that night with the letter still clutched in her hand, dreaming of ravens and swords and a voice that whispered from the darkness, "I have waited longer." The morning of her departure dawned gray and cold, the spring rains having given way to a stubborn mist that clung to the ground like grief made visible. Evangeline dressed carefully in her best traveling costume, a deep blue wool that brought out the color of her eyes, and descended the stairs to find her family assembled in the entrance hall with all the enthusiasm of mourners at a funeral. Her mother wept, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief that was already sodden. My darling girl, my poor, poor darling girl. To think it has come to this. Courage, mother. Evangeline submitted to her mother's embrace with stiff courtesy. I am told the Duke's estate is quite beautiful. Perhaps you might visit someday. Visit? In the north? The Countess shuddered delicately. I'm sure I shouldn't survive the journey. The air up there is said to be positively savage. Her sisters offered their farewells with varying degrees of sincerity. Margaret with barely concealed glee at having the spotlight to herself for the upcoming season. The younger girls with genuine if shallow sympathy for a sister they had never particularly liked. Her father stood apart from the others, his face closed and unreadable. When Evangeline approached him, he did not reach for her, did not offer any words of comfort or blessing. Remember your duty, was all he said. To your husband, to your family, to your position. You are a Witmore, whatever else you may become. Do not forget that. I am unlikely to forget anything about this day, Father. Evangeline's voice was steady, but something in her eyes made him look away. Or any of the circumstances that led to it. Before he could respond, if he intended to respond at all, the clatter of hooves and wheels announced an arrival outside. But it was not the Duke's carriage that had drawn up before the house. It was Lord Ashton Fairfax. He dismounted in a spray of mud and gravel, his golden hair disheveled, his riding clothes splattered with evidence of a hard journey. He looked nothing like the perfectly polished gentleman who had courted her so decorously for 3 seasons. He looked wild, desperate, slightly mad. Evangeline, wait. She paused with her hand on the carriage door. The Duke's carriage, which had arrived the night before, all black lacquer and silver fittings, with the raven crest emblazoned on its doors. Lord Fairfax, this is unexpected. Don't do this. He pushed past her startled family and seized her hands. Propriety be damned. Don't marry him. Come with me instead. We'll go to Scotland, to Gretna Green. I'll make you my wife before anyone can stop us. The words hung in the misty air between them, impossible and tempting and utterly inadequate. Gretna Green, the Scottish village just across the border, famous for its irregular marriages, Unions that could be performed quickly, without parental consent, valid under Scottish law, though they might raise eyebrows in English society. Runaway couples had been eloping there for decades, escaping disapproving families and inconvenient prior arrangements. For one wild, reckless moment, Evangeline actually considered it. Then reality reasserted itself. "You had 3 years to make me that offer," she said quietly, pulling her hands free of his grasp. 3 years in which an elopement would have been romantic rather than desperate. "Why now, Ashton? Why only when another man has claimed me?" "Because I didn't realize. I didn't understand." "You didn't understand what? That I might not wait forever? That my father's debts might force his hand?" She stepped back, putting distance between them. "Or that losing me to another man might wound your pride?" His handsome face contorted. "You think this is about pride? I think you never truly wanted me, Ashton. Not really. You wanted the idea of me, a pretty ornament for your arm, a suitable future countess to manage your household and bear your heirs. But you never loved me. If you had, you wouldn't have waited 3 seasons to speak. You wouldn't have let me dangle in uncertainty while you weighed your options and calculated your advantages. And you think the blind Duke loves you?" Ashton's voice turned cruel, the polished veneer cracking to reveal something ugly beneath. "You think that recluse in his crumbling northern castle has any idea what you look like, what you sound like, who you are? He bought you, Evangeline, purchased you like a horse at auction. There's nothing romantic about that." "No," she agreed, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. "There isn't. But at least he made a decision. At least he acted. You simply watched and waited and assumed I would always be available whenever you finally made up your mind." She turned her back on him and climbed into the carriage, settling onto the velvet-upholstered seat with as much dignity as she could muster. "Evangeline, goodbye, Lord Fairfax." She did not look at him as she spoke to the coachman. "Drive on." The carriage lurched forward, and through the window she watched Ashton standing in the mist, his handsome face twisted with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Anger, perhaps, or wounded pride, or the first stirrings of something that might, in a different man, have been regret. She did not look back again. The journey north took 4 days, exactly as promised. At each stopping point, coaching inns chosen for their cleanliness and discretion, Evangeline found that preparations had been made for her arrival. The best rooms had been reserved, fires lit in the grates, hot meals waiting. The innkeepers treated her with a deference that spoke of generous advance payments and very specific instructions. "The Duke's orders, my lady," they would say when she attempted to thank them. "His Grace was most particular about your comfort." On the second day, a box was waiting for her at the inn, velvet-lined, containing a pair of kidskin gloves in exactly her size, dyed the same deep blue as her traveling costume. There was no note, but the message was clear. He knew what she was wearing. Somehow, impossibly, he knew. On the third day, she found a book she had mentioned wanting to read in a letter to her mother months ago. A Gothic novel by a female author that had caused a minor scandal in literary circles. The pages were crisp and new, the binding uncracked. It had been purchased specifically for her. On the fourth day, as the carriage climbed into the wild, rolling hills of the northern counties, she discovered a final gift tucked into the pocket of the carriage door. A small silver pendant in the shape of a raven, its eye set with a single diamond that caught the light like a captured star. She fastened it around her neck and did not remove it. Aldridge Park revealed itself in stages, like a shy lover slowly removing her veils. First came the gates, massive iron structures flanked by stone pillars, the raven crest worked into the metalwork with careful artistry. Then the long drive through ancient woodland, oaks and beeches pressing close on either side, their branches intertwining overhead to create a living tunnel of green and gold. Then, as the carriage crested a final rise, the house itself. Evangeline's breath caught in her throat. She had expected darkness, decay, a Gothic nightmare of crumbling towers and overgrown gardens, something to match the tragic narrative society had constructed around the blind Duke and his self-imposed exile. Instead, she found herself gazing upon one of the most beautiful houses she had ever seen. Aldridge Park sprawled across the landscape like a poem written in stone and glass, all elegant symmetry and honey-colored limestone, glowing in the late afternoon light. The main house was Palladian in style. She recognized the influence from the architecture books she had studied as a girl, with a grand portico supported by Corinthian columns, perfectly proportioned wings extending on either side, and hundreds of windows that caught the sun and threw it back like scattered diamonds. The gardens were magnificent even in early spring, formal parterres giving way to rolling parkland, which in turn dissolved into the ancient woodland through which she had just passed. A lake glittered in the distance, its surface still as a mirror, reflecting the clouds that drifted overhead. It was nothing like she had imagined. It was nothing like the prison she had prepared herself to endure. It was beautiful. The carriage rolled to a stop before the grand entrance, and footmen in black and silver livery materialized to open the door, lower the steps, assist her descent onto the gravel drive. A housekeeper in severe black bombazine waited at the top of the stairs, a thin, pale woman with steel-gray hair pulled back from a face that revealed nothing. "Lady Evangeline," the woman curtsied with precise formality. "I am Mrs. Blackwood, housekeeper of Aldridge Park. His Grace has asked me to convey his apologies. He is indisposed this afternoon and will not be able to greet you personally. However, he has requested that you join him for dinner this evening. I will show you to your rooms." Indisposed? A polite fiction, surely. The man was blind, after all. What possible business could have detained him? But Evangeline merely nodded and followed Mrs. Blackwood into the house, her eyes struggling to take in everything at once. The entrance hall alone was larger than the entire ground floor of Witmore Manor, a soaring space of marble and gilt, with a grand staircase sweeping upward in a graceful curve. Portraits lined the walls, generations of vanes staring down with the haughty assurance of those born to wealth and power. Crystal chandeliers hung from a ceiling painted with allegorical scenes, gods and goddesses, clouds and sunlight, figures from mythology arranged in tableaux of triumph and tragedy. It was overwhelming. It was magnificent. It was the kind of wealth that made her father's gambling debts seem almost reasonable. What was a few £1,000s to a family that could afford to paint their ceilings with gold leaf? Her rooms were in the east wing, a suite of chambers that made her quarters at Witmore Manor look like servant accommodations, a sitting room decorated in shades of cream and rose, with comfortable furniture arranged around a fireplace large enough to roast an ox, a dressing room lined with wardrobes that could hold 100 gowns, and a bedchamber dominated by a 4-poster bed draped in silk the color of champagne, with windows overlooking the formal gardens below. "His Grace hoped the rooms would be to your liking," Mrs. Blackwood said, her voice carefully neutral. "If anything is not to your satisfaction, you have only to ask." "They're beautiful." Evangeline turned in a slow circle, trying to absorb it all. "More than beautiful. I've never seen anything like this." Something flickered across the housekeeper's face. Surprise, perhaps, or approval. "Dinner will be served at 8, my lady. I will send a maid to assist you in dressing." After she left, Evangeline stood for a long time at the window, watching the shadows lengthen across the gardens as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon. Somewhere in this vast and beautiful house, her future husband waited, a man she had never seen, a man who could not see her, a man who had, for reasons she did not yet understand, chosen to purchase her from her desperate father and bring her to this isolated paradise in the wild north of England. "Who are you?" she wondered, her breath fogging the glass. "And what do you want from me?" Dinner was served in what Mrs. Blackwood called the small dining room, though there was nothing small about it. A table that could seat 20 had been set for 2, with candles arranged along its length and a fire crackling in the enormous hearth. The walls were hung with dark silk, the ceiling coffered and gilded, the floor laid with ancient stone that must have been original to the medieval structure upon which the modern house had been built. Evangeline had dressed with care, her best evening gown, a deep wine-colored silk that her mother had initially declared too mature for an unmarried woman. Well, she was about to be married, and the color suited her better than the pastel society decreed appropriate for young ladies. She wore the raven pendant at her throat and had instructed the maid to arrange her hair simply, swept up to expose the line of her neck. If her husband-to-be could not see her, she reasoned, she might as well dress for her own satisfaction. He was already seated when she entered, at the far end of the table, where the candlelight seemed to gather and pool around him like liquid gold. Her first impression was of darkness, dark hair falling across a forehead that seemed permanently furrowed in thought. Dark clothing, evening dress so perfectly tailored it must have cost more than her father's annual income. Dark presence, commanding attention without seeming to try, drawing the eye and holding it with the effortless gravity of a natural force. Then he turned toward the sound of her entrance, and she saw his eyes. They were gray. Not the pale, washed-out gray of winter skies, but deep and luminous, like storm clouds lit from within by distant lightning. Even in the candlelight, they seemed to glow, alive with an intelligence that belied the story of his blindness. But they were unfocused. They pointed in her general direction but did not quite find her, sliding past her shoulder to fix on empty air. Blind, she reminded herself, her heart hammering in her chest. He is blind. He cannot see you. "Miss Witmore." His voice was deep and rich, with an accent that spoke of Oxford and old money, of centuries of breeding and privilege. "I apologize for not greeting you upon your arrival. I find that first impressions are complicated, given my condition. I thought you might prefer to settle in before confronting the reality of your situation." "The reality of my situation, Your Grace." "A husband who cannot see your face." He smiled, and even blind, the expression transformed his features into something approaching warmth. "A house full of strangers in a part of the country you've never visited. A marriage you did not choose to a man you've never met." He gestured to the seat at his right hand. "Please, sit. You must be exhausted from your journey." Evangeline moved to the indicated chair, acutely aware of his head tracking her movement, following the sound of her footsteps, the rustle of her skirts. He might not be able to see her, but he was clearly attending to her with a focus that made her skin prickle with awareness. "I have questions," she said, settling into her seat. "As your letter suggested I might." "Ask them." "Why me?" It was the question that had haunted her since her father's announcement, the mystery that no amount of speculation had been able to solve. Why would one of the wealthiest men in England, blind or not, choose to purchase a woman he had never met? Why offer such a generous sum for a bride who was past her prime marriageable age, whose family had no particular distinction, whose only notable quality was her availability? Benedict was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had changed, deeper somehow, and more intense. "You are not the first woman your father offered to me," he said. "When my agents approached him about a potential match, he initially proposed your younger sister Margaret. She is prettier," he said, "more accomplished, better suited to be a duchess." Evangeline felt a cold shock run through her. Margaret? Her father had offered Margaret first? I refused. Benedict's unseeing eyes seemed to burn in the candlelight. "I told him I wanted you, Evangeline. Only you. And when he asked why, I told him that it was none of his concern." "But it's my concern," she pressed. "I deserve to know why you chose me." "Yes," he nodded slowly. "You do. But that answer will take longer than a single evening. For now, let me say only this. I have my reasons, and they are not entirely mercenary. Your father sold you to pay his debts, but I did not purchase you to acquire a servant or a nursemaid. I purchased you because—" He paused, seeming to search for words. "Because I believe we might suit each other, in ways that neither society nor your family would understand." It wasn't an answer. It was barely even an explanation, but something in his voice, some quality of sincerity that she had not expected from a man who had purchased her like property, made her hold her tongue. The meal that followed was exquisite and strange. Exquisite, because the food was better than anything Evangeline had ever eaten. Course after course of delicacies prepared by what must be a master chef, served on porcelain so fine it was nearly transparent. Strange, because her dining companion was quite obviously not as blind as he appeared. She noticed it in small ways at first. The way his hand found his wine glass without fumbling, without the tentative searching gestures she would expect from a man who could not see. The way he served himself from dishes placed before him with confident precision. The way his head turned to follow sounds that a truly blind man might not have registered. The soft footfall of a servant approaching from behind, the creak of a door opening in the hallway. But most telling of all was the way he looked at her. Not at her, precisely. He never quite met her eyes, never fixed his gaze on her face with the directness of a sighted man. But he looked toward her with an intensity that felt almost physical, as though he were memorizing her presence through some sense that went beyond ordinary vision. "You are observant," he said suddenly, and she realized with a start that she had been staring at him, studying him with an attention that bordered on rudeness. "Forgive me. I did not mean to be impolite. On the contrary, I would be disappointed if you accepted my condition at face value without question." That strange, sharp smile flickered across his face again. "Tell me what you've noticed." Evangeline hesitated. The observation that had been forming in her mind felt dangerous, a suspicion that, if spoken aloud, could not be unspoken. "You move very confidently for a man who cannot see," she said carefully. "Your wine glass, your fork. You never fumble, never search. Either you have memorized the placement of every object on this table with extraordinary precision. Or your blindness is not as complete as the world believes." The silence that followed was so profound that Evangeline could hear the candles guttering in their holders, the distant creak of the old house settling around them. Then Benedict laughed, a low, rich sound that seemed to vibrate through her bones. "Perceptive," he said, "and brave. Most people who notice such inconsistencies convince themselves they are mistaken. It's far easier to accept the story than to question it. I have never found self-deception to be a useful skill. No. His gray eyes, his seeing, knowing, burning gray eyes, turned toward her with an intensity that stole her breath. I don't suppose you have." He rose from his seat, and for the first time, Evangeline saw him move without the careful hesitation of a blind man. He crossed to a cabinet against the wall, opened it, and withdrew a decanter of amber liquid with the easy confidence of someone who could see exactly what he was reaching for. "I have a proposition for you, Miss Witmore," he said, pouring 2 glasses of what appeared to be brandy. "I will answer your questions, all of them, truthfully and completely. But not tonight." "Why not tonight?" "Because we are to be married tomorrow." He returned to the table and set a glass before her. "And I would prefer you to speak your vows without the full knowledge of what you are agreeing to. Call it a test, if you like. I want to know if you will trust me, if you can trust me, before I reveal truths that might make trust impossible. That seems rather unfair." "Yes." He reclaimed his seat, swirling the brandy in his glass. "It is. But I have learned that fairness is a luxury the world rarely affords. I am asking you to marry me tomorrow, Evangeline, knowing nothing about me except that I am not what I appear. In exchange, I am offering you something that I suspect no one has ever offered you before." "And what is that?" He leaned forward, and for the first time, his eyes met hers directly, not sliding past, not fixed on empty air, but locked onto her gaze with a precision that proved beyond any doubt that he could see her perfectly clearly. "The truth," he said. "All of it. Every secret I have kept, every lie I have told, every reason behind every action I have taken to bring you here. But only after you have bound yourself to me in the eyes of God and the law. Only after there is no escape." It was madness. She should refuse, should demand answers now, should threaten to flee, should do anything except agree to this bizarre bargain. But she thought of London and the whispers that would follow her if she returned. She thought of her father, who had sold her without a second thought. She thought of Ashton Fairfax, who had wanted her only when she was no longer available. And she thought of this man, this strange, intense, clearly dangerous man who was looking at her with eyes that actually saw her. Not her dowry, not her family connections, not her potential as a future countess. Her. "Very well," she heard herself say. "I will marry you tomorrow, and then you will tell me everything." Benedict smiled, a real smile this time, one that reached his eyes and transformed his face from severe to almost handsome. "Then we have a bargain, Miss Witmore." He raised his glass. "To truth." "To truth," she echoed and drank. The wedding took place the following afternoon in the ancient chapel attached to Aldridge Park. It was a small ceremony, intimate by aristocratic standards, with only the household servants as witnesses and a vicar who had clearly been well compensated for his discretion. The chapel itself was beautiful in a medieval way, all stone arches and stained glass windows that threw patterns of colored light across the worn floor. Evangeline's wedding dress had been waiting in her chambers that morning, cream, silk, and Brussels lace, more beautiful than anything she had ever owned. It fit perfectly, as though it had been made for her, though she could not imagine how such measurements could have been taken without her knowledge. She would learn later that they had been. That Benedict had agents who had observed her for years, who had measured her with their eyes and reported every detail back to their master. But that knowledge was still hours away. Her father was not there. None of her family was there. She walked down the aisle alone, her steps echoing in the hushed space, toward the man who waited at the altar. Benedict had resumed his performance of blindness for the ceremony, his eyes carefully unfocused, his movements tentative and searching. The vicar guided his hand as he placed the ring on her finger, a heavy band of gold set with diamonds and sapphires that must have been in the Vane family for generations. "I, Benedict Augustus Vane, take thee, Evangeline Grace Witmore, to be my wedded wife." The words washed over her like water, ancient and immutable, binding her to this stranger with bonds that the law would not easily dissolve. The Matrimonial Causes Act, when it finally passed in 1857, would make divorce possible under extremely limited circumstances, but even then, it would require proof of adultery, abandonment, or extreme cruelty. A woman could not simply walk away from a marriage because she discovered her husband was not what he had seemed. To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part. When it was her turn to speak, Evangeline found her voice surprisingly steady. I, Evangeline Grace Whitmore, take thee. Benedict Augustus Vane. The ring settled onto her finger like a shackle, or perhaps like a key. The vicar pronounced them man and wife, and Benedict lifted her veil with hands that only trembled slightly. He kissed her, a brief, formal brush of lips that nonetheless sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. And then, it was done. She was the Duchess of Aldridge, whatever that meant. The wedding breakfast was mercifully brief, an elegant meal shared by two people who were strangers in every way that mattered, making stilted conversation, while servants hovered discreetly in the background. By late afternoon, Evangeline had retreated to her chambers, ostensibly to rest before dinner, in reality to gather her thoughts before the night that lay ahead, the wedding night. She knew what was expected, of course. Every well-bred young lady was informed of her marital duties before her wedding. In Evangeline's case, through a painfully awkward conversation with her mother that had involved much blushing and euphemism and very little actual useful information. A wife must submit to her husband. A wife must bear his children. A wife must never refuse him, no matter her own feelings on the matter. These were the rules that governed respectable society, as immutable as the laws of physics. A married woman's body belonged to her husband, just as her property belonged to him, just as her legal identity belonged to him. She had no right to refuse, no standing to object, no recourse if he chose to exercise his rights with force. Evangeline was not naive enough to believe that her wedding night would be tender or romantic. She was prepared for pain, for discomfort, for the fundamental indignity of giving herself to a man she barely knew. What she was not prepared for was what actually happened. The clock had just struck 10 when the knock came at the connecting door between her chambers and the Duke's. Evangeline had changed into her nightgown, white silk and fine cotton, modest by contemporary standards, designed to signal virginal innocence rather than any actual attempt at seduction. Her hair hung loose down her back, brushed to a shine by the maid who had attended her, who had offered whispered words of encouragement before slipping away to leave her mistress to her fate. "Come in," she called, and was proud that her voice barely shook. Benedict entered, and she immediately noticed that he had changed as well, not into night clothes, but into a simpler version of his earlier attire. White shirt, dark trousers, bare feet. He had removed his cravat and unfastened the top buttons of his shirt, revealing a triangle of skin at his throat that seemed almost indecently intimate. He closed the door behind him and leaned against it, making no move to approach her, where she sat on the edge of the bed. "You're afraid," he said. It was not a question. "Should I not be?" "Probably." He pushed off from the door and crossed to the fireplace, where a fire had been lit against the chill of the spring evening. "I have given you very little reason to trust me. I have admitted to deceptions I have not yet explained. I have bound you to me legally while withholding information that any reasonable woman would demand before making such a commitment. And yet, here I am. Yes." He turned to face her, and in the firelight, his features were cast in sharp relief, all angles and shadows, beautiful and dangerous. "Here you are. My wife. My Duchess. Mine." The possessiveness in that final word sent a shiver through her that was not entirely unpleasant. You promised me truth, she reminded him. All of it, you said. Every secret. I did. He moved to a chair near the fire and sat, gesturing for her to join him. Not the bed, the chair opposite his, where they might speak as equals, rather than as predator and prey. Evangeline rose from the bed and crossed to join him, acutely aware of how the firelight rendered her nightgown nearly transparent. But Benedict did not look at her body, or rather, he looked, with eyes that clearly saw every detail, but his gaze remained fixed on her face. "Where shall I begin?" he asked. "At the beginning. Why do you pretend to be blind?" Benedict was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice had changed, deeper, rougher, as though the words were being dragged from some place he kept carefully locked away. 7 years ago, he said, I attended a ball at Lady Ashworth's house in London. I was 25 years old, heir to one of the greatest fortunes in England, and thoroughly bored with every aspect of my existence. I had been raised to expect power, wealth, influence, and I had found that possessing these things brought me no satisfaction whatsoever. I went through the motions of aristocratic life because I didn't know what else to do, but I felt nothing, wanted nothing, cared about nothing. He paused, and Evangeline waited. And then I saw you. The words fell into the silence like stones dropped into still water. You were 16 years old, Benedict continued, newly presented to society, wearing a white gown with blue ribbons in your hair. You were dancing with Lord Pemberton's youngest son, who had 2 left feet and no sense of rhythm, and you were laughing at something he had said. Not a polite society laugh, a real one, full of genuine delight. I don't remember that night. You wouldn't. I made certain not to approach you, not to make myself known. You were a child, Evangeline, 16 years old, innocent, full of a joy I had never known and did not know how to handle. His hands clenched on the arms of his chair. But I could not stop thinking about you, could not stop watching you. Every ball I attended after that night, I searched for you. Every garden party, every dinner, every gathering of the ton. I was there, watching from a distance, cataloging every smile, every gesture, every word that fell from your lips. That's unsettling. Yes. He met her eyes, and the rawness in his gaze made her breath catch. It was. It is. I am not telling you this to excuse my behavior, Evangeline. I am telling you because you asked for truth, and this is the truth. I became obsessed with you. Utterly, completely, destructively obsessed. So, you pretended to go blind? Not immediately. He rose from his chair and began to pace, his movements restless and predatory. For 2 years, I tried to court you normally. I danced with you at balls. Do you remember? I requested introductions, made conversation, did all the things a gentleman does when he wishes to pursue a lady. Evangeline searched her memory. I remember a few dances. You were very formal, very proper. I was terrified. The admission seemed to cost him something. I had never wanted anything the way I wanted you. And I knew with absolute certainty, that if I pursued you openly, if I declared my intentions, I would destroy whatever chance I had. You were 18 by then, of marriageable age, but I was 27 and already known as cold, withdrawn, difficult. Your family would have rejected my suit. Society would have gossiped about the age, difference, about my reputation, about 100 other things. And worst of all, he stopped pacing and turned to face her. Worst of all, I might have frightened you away. So you disappeared instead. I staged an accident. His voice was flat, emotionless. I rode out in a storm, took a fall from my horse, struck my head. The injury was real. I lost consciousness for 2 days, and when I woke, my vision was genuinely impaired. For 2 weeks, I could barely see. The physicians predicted permanent damage, but you recovered. Within a month, my sight was fully restored, but I told no one. I let the world believe the worst. I dismissed most of my staff, retreated to this estate, and became what they called me. The blind duke, the tragic recluse, the man who had been destroyed by fate and could no longer bear the company of his peers. For 7 years, Evangeline's voice was barely a whisper. You lived as a blind man for 7 years. For me. For you. He crossed to her chair and knelt before her, actually knelt, this proud duke, this lord of a vast estate, bringing himself to her level. I removed myself from the marriage market so that no other man could claim you. I watched from a distance as suitor after suitor came and went. Lord Fairfax, who courted you for 3 seasons without ever committing. Lord Pemberton's son, who finally married a woman with a larger dowry. A dozen others who saw your worth but lacked the courage or the resources to pursue you properly. You watched. All that time. I had agents in London, servants, shopkeepers, anyone who might have access to information about your life. They sent regular reports, what you wore, where you went, who spoke to you, whether you seemed happy or sad. His hands came up to frame her face, gentle and desperate. I know everything about you, Evangeline. I know that your favorite color is blue, that you prefer novels to poetry, that you practice piano when you think no one is listening, but never perform for others because you believe yourself inadequate. I know that your younger sister torments you with petty cruelties, that your mother never forgave you for not being prettier, that your father sees you as nothing but a commodity to be traded. Tears had begun to slip down her cheeks, though she could not have said whether they were tears of fear or something else entirely. I know that you cried for 3 hours after Lord Fairfax failed to propose at the midsummer ball last year, Benedict continued, his thumbs brushing away her tears. I know that you walked in Hyde Park every Tuesday morning and fed the ducks, because that was the only time you could be alone without a chaperone questioning your whereabouts. I know that you once wrote in your journal that you wished you could disappear entirely, become invisible, escape the endless performance of being a woman in a world that sees you as nothing more than a decorative object to be acquired and displayed. How do you know about my journal? I bought your lady's maid. He did not flinch from the admission. 3 years ago, she sends me copies of anything interesting. Evangeline should have been horrified, should have been furious, should have felt violated by this revelation that her most private thoughts had been read by a stranger, catalogued and collected like specimens in a cabinet. Instead, she felt something she had not expected. She felt seen. For the first time in her entire life, someone had actually paid attention to her. Not to her marriageability, not to her family connections, not to her potential usefulness as a wife or mother or hostess. To her, to the person she actually was, beneath all the performance and pretense. You should hate me, Benedict said quietly. What I've done, the surveillance, the manipulation, the purchase of your hand from a father who should have protected you, it's monstrous. I know that. I've always known that. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't stay away. You became the only thing that mattered to me, Evangeline. The only point of light in a life that had become entirely dark. The blindness, she whispered. It wasn't just a disguise. No, his smile was bitter. It was a metaphor. I was blind, Evangeline. Truly blind to everything except you. Blind to pleasure, to purpose, to any possibility of happiness that did not include you. I built my entire existence around the goal of claiming you. And now that I have," he swallowed hard, "now that I have, I find I don't know what to do next. I don't know how to be a husband. I only know how to want." "Then learn." The words came out stronger than she intended, surprising both of them. "You've had 7 years to watch me from a distance. Now you have the rest of our lives to know me up close. If you can spy on my journal entries and buy my lady's maid and purchase my hand from my worthless father, you can certainly learn how to be a decent husband." Benedict stared at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his silver eyes. "You're not afraid anymore," he said. "No." She reached out and touched his face, the first time she had voluntarily touched him since their wedding. "I'm angry. I'm confused. I'm not certain whether to feel flattered or violated by everything you've just told me. But I'm not afraid, because for the first time in my life, someone has actually seen me. Not the performance. Me. I've always seen you," he said hoarsely. "Only you. From the moment you laughed at that boy's terrible dancing, I've seen no one else." She kissed him then, not because she felt she had to, not because it was her wifely duty, but because she wanted to know what it felt like to kiss a man who had devoted 7 years of his life to wanting her. It felt like drowning, like burning, like coming home to a place she had never known existed. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Benedict's eyes had gone dark with something that made her pulse race. "I need to show you something," he said, "before we go any further. One more truth. The worst one." Evangeline nodded, and he rose to his feet, extending his hand to help her up. "Come with me." He led her through the darkened corridors of Aldridge Park, past ancient portraits and priceless tapestries, up a narrow staircase that spiraled into one of the house's original medieval towers. The air grew colder as they climbed, the stone walls pressing close, torches flickering in iron sconces that looked as old as the house itself. At the top of the stairs was a door, heavy oak bound with iron, with a lock that looked newly installed. Benedict produced a key from his pocket. "No one has been in this room except me since I returned from London 7 years ago," he said. "What you see inside. I need you to understand that it is the product of obsession, of madness, perhaps, but it is also the truest expression of what you have meant to me." He unlocked the door and pushed it open. Evangeline stepped inside, and her breath stopped. The room was circular, occupying the entire top floor of the tower. Windows had been cut into the ancient walls, letting in moonlight that spilled across a space that defied description. Every surface was covered with her image: paintings, sketches, miniature portraits, silhouettes cut from black paper, a marble bust that captured her features with uncanny accuracy. Pressed flowers, dried roses, forget-me-nots, violets, arranged in frames alongside notations in Benedict's distinctive hand. From the Pemberton Garden Party, June 1848. She wore them in her hair. Dance cards, saved from balls she barely remembered attending. A glove she had lost 3 years ago at the opera. A ribbon from a bonnet she had given to a charity jumble sale. A lock of hair. Her hair, she realized with a shock, obtained God knew how. And everywhere, the raven symbol. Worked into frames, carved into wooden boxes, embroidered on cushions and hangings. The Duke of Aldridge's crest, repeated obsessively, as though marking territory. "This is my shrine to you," Benedict said quietly, standing in the doorway, while she moved through the room in stunned silence. "Every item here I obtained myself, or had obtained for me. Every image was commissioned from artists who saw you at various events, who sketched you without your knowledge, and brought those sketches to me. I have spent a fortune on this room, Evangeline. I have spent 7 years of my life building it, and until tonight, I was not certain I would ever show it to anyone." Evangeline stopped before the largest painting, a full-length portrait of herself in the blue gown she had worn to Lady Hartington's ball 2 years ago. The artist had captured her in motion, turning toward some sound outside the frame, her lips parted as though about to speak. She looked alive, beautiful, real. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say nothing, if you prefer." Benedict remained in the doorway, making no move to enter. "I know what this looks like. I know what it makes me. But I wanted you to see it, to understand the depth of what you have inspired in me. Not because I expect your forgiveness or your understanding. Simply because you asked for truth, and this is the truest thing I have." Evangeline turned slowly, taking in the full scope of the room. The years of careful collection, the fortune spent, the obsessive attention to detail. It was disturbing, invasive, borderline criminal in a time when laws about such things barely existed. And yet she could not deny the strange, twisted beauty of it. This man, this wealthy, powerful, clearly troubled man, had built a temple to her, had devoted years of his life to preserving every trace of her existence, every fleeting moment when their lives had crossed. No one had ever cared about her this much. No one had ever seen her as worthy of such devotion. "It's terrifying," she said finally, "and disturbing, and probably evidence of a deeply unwell mind." Benedict flinched, but did not look away. "But it's also," she continued, "the most romantic thing anyone has ever done for me." She crossed the room to stand before him, reaching up to cup his face in her hands as he had done to her earlier. "I don't know what this marriage will be," she said. "I don't know if I can ever fully trust a man who has done what you've done. But I know that you see me, Benedict. You've seen me for 7 years, and for now, tonight, that is enough." She kissed him, and this time he kissed her back with a desperation that stole her breath. "Take me to bed," she whispered against his lips, "and show me what you've been dreaming about for 7 years." He did. The weeks that followed Evangeline's wedding were a strange and heady time. By day, she learned her new home, the vast library with its thousands of volumes, the conservatory filled with exotic plants, the music room where a beautiful pianoforte awaited her touch. She met with Mrs. Blackwood and learned the rhythms of the household. She walked the gardens, rode out to visit tenant farms, began to understand the scope of the estate she now nominally commanded, and she learned about her husband. Benedict was brilliant, perhaps the most intelligent person she had ever met. He read voraciously in 6 languages, on subjects ranging from ancient history to modern engineering. He corresponded with scholars and scientists across Europe. He had ideas about agriculture, about industry, about the future of England that were years ahead of his time. But he was also damaged in ways that went beyond his obsession with her. She learned about his childhood in fragments, a father who had been cold and demanding, a mother who had died when he was 12, an upbringing that had emphasized duty and achievement above all else. He had been raised to be the perfect heir, and in becoming that perfect heir, he had lost the ability to feel anything at all, until her. "You were the first person who made me want something," he told her one night, lying in the darkness of their shared bed. "The first person who made me feel anything beyond the numbness that had become my natural state. I don't know if what I feel for you is love, Evangeline. I'm not certain I know what love is. But I know that you are the center of my existence, the point around which everything else revolves. That's a heavy burden to place on one person." "I know." His hand found hers in the darkness. "I'm trying to learn how to bear some of it myself, but it's difficult. I've spent so long focused entirely on you that I don't quite know how to focus on anything else. By night, he was a revelation. Evangeline had expected her marital duties to be something to be endured, a necessary unpleasantness in exchange for the security of marriage. Instead, she discovered that Benedict's 7 years of obsessive wanting had made him exquisitely attentive to her pleasure, seemed to know her body better than she knew it herself, anticipating what she needed before she knew she needed it. "I've imagined this so many times," he murmured against her skin one night. "In so many ways. I want to learn what's real, what you actually feel, not what I've fantasized about. And if the reality disappoints, impossible." He raised his head to look at her, those silver eyes burning in the candlelight. "Nothing about you could ever disappoint me. I've waited 7 years for you, Evangeline. Every moment of that waiting was worth it." 2 months after the wedding, Lord Ashton Fairfax came to call. The announcement of his arrival came during breakfast, a footman entering with a silver salver bearing a calling card that made Evangeline's stomach clench. "Lord Fairfax presents his compliments," the footman reported, "and requests an audience with the Duchess. He says he has business in the area and wishes to pay his respects." Benedict's expression went carefully, blank, a mask settling over his features that Evangeline had learned to recognize as his way of containing intense emotion. "Business in the area," he repeated flatly. "How convenient. I should see him." Evangeline set down her teacup with deliberate care. "Better to resolve whatever this is directly than to let it fester. I don't want you alone with him. Then join us." She met his eyes steadily. "But I won't hide from him, Benedict. I've spent too much of my life being afraid of what other people might think or say or do. I'm done hiding." Something shifted in his expression. Pride, perhaps, or approval. He inclined his head. "Very well. Show Lord Fairfax to the blue drawing room," he instructed the footman. "We will join him shortly." The blue drawing room was one of the smaller public rooms at Aldridge Park, still grand by ordinary standards, but intimate enough to feel almost cozy. Ashton was standing by the window when they entered, sunlight catching his golden hair and perfect features. He turned at the sound of their approach, and Evangeline saw his eyes widen slightly as he took in Benedict at her side, walking normally, moving with the confident grace of a sighted man, meeting Ashton's gaze with silver eyes that clearly saw everything. "Lord Fairfax," Benedict's voice was silky and dangerous. "What a pleasant surprise. I wasn't aware you had any interests this far north." "Your Grace." Ashton's bow was stiff, his composure visibly shaken. "I confess I wasn't expecting. That is to say, I had understood." "That I was blind?" Benedict smiled, showing too many teeth. "Yes, that was rather the point of the deception. Do sit down, Lord Fairfax. You look as though you might fall over." They settled into chairs arranged around the fireplace, Evangeline beside her husband, Ashton across from them, looking increasingly uncertain about why he had come. "The Duchess mentioned you have business in the area," Benedict continued, his tone pleasant in a way that somehow managed to convey menace. "What business would that be precisely?" That is," Ashton rallied visibly, squaring his shoulders. "I came to see Evangeline, Lady Aldridge, to satisfy myself that she is being treated well." "How chivalrous!" Benedict's smile didn't waver. "And what exactly prompted this concern for my wife's well-being? Some rumor you heard in London? Some suspicion that the blind Duke might be mistreating his bride? People talk." Ashton's voice had turned defensive. "There have been rumors about this household for years, about the servants who come and go, the isolation, the secrecy. Now that Evangeline, Lady Aldridge, is installed here, it's only natural that people would wonder. Wonder what, precisely? Whether she's happy." Ashton's eyes cut to Evangeline. whether she came here willingly, whether this marriage was truly her choice or simply the result of her father's desperation. My marriage was not my choice, Evangeline said calmly. It was arranged by my father to pay his debts, as you well know. But my presence in this house is very much my choice. I chose to stay after the wedding, and I choose to remain now. Whatever concerns you may have about my welfare, I assure you they are misplaced. Are they? Ashton leaned forward, his expression earnest. Evangeline, you don't have to protect him. If he's hurt you, if he's keeping you here against your will, he has done neither. She cut him off with a sharpness that made him flinch. My husband treats me with nothing but devotion and respect, more than I ever received from you, certainly. That's not fair, isn't it? She rose from her seat, and both men rose with her. Ashton from courtesy, Benedict from protective instinct. You courted me for 3 years, Lord Fairfax, 3 years of dances and flowers and pretty words, and in all that time, you never once made me feel seen. Never once looked at me as though I mattered for anything beyond my suitability as a future countess. I cared about you. You cared about the idea of me. The words came out flat and final. A pretty ornament for your arm, a suitable hostess for your dinner parties, a body to bear your heirs. You never once asked what I wanted, what I dreamed about, who I actually was beneath all the performance. She gestured toward Benedict, who had moved to stand at her shoulder, a united front against the intruder in their home. My husband may have employed unconventional methods to claim me, she continued, but at least he paid attention. At least he saw me as a person rather than a commodity, which is more than I can say for you. Ashton's face had gone red with humiliation. I came here to help you. I don't need your help. Evangeline stepped closer to Benedict, feeling his hand come to rest at the small of her back. I'm exactly where I want to be, Lord Fairfax, and I would thank you not to call again. The dismissal hung in the air, stark and final. Ashton looked, between them, the blind duke who wasn't blind, the purchased bride who seemed anything but unhappy, and something shifted in his expression. The earnest concern melted away, replaced by something uglier. You'll regret this, he said quietly. Both of you. When London learns the truth about this household, about the deceptions, the lies, the obsession that brought you together, you'll be ruined. No one will receive you. No one will. No one will what? Benedict's voice was soft and deadly. Gossip about us? They already do. Pity my wife for her unfortunate circumstances. They already do. Cut us from their invitation lists? He laughed, a harsh sound. I haven't attended a social function in 7 years, Lord Fairfax. I hardly think I'll miss them now. And I never particularly enjoyed them to begin with, Evangeline added. So threaten away, my lord. We have nothing to lose that we haven't already lost. Ashton stared at them for a long moment, his handsome face twisted with impotent fury. You deserve each other, he spat. 2 monsters pretending to be human. Perhaps. Benedict's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. But we are very happy monsters, which is more than can be said for you. Good day, Lord Fairfax. I trust you can find your own way out. The footman appeared as if summoned by magic, escorting the furious Viscount from the room with pointed efficiency. Evangeline waited until she heard the front door close before allowing herself to sag against her husband's chest. That was unpleasant, she murmured, but necessary. Benedict pressed a kiss to her hair. He won't trouble us again. His pride won't allow him to admit he was rejected twice. I hope you're right. I'm always right. His arms tightened around her. Except when I'm spectacularly wrong, in which case I prefer not to discuss it. Despite everything, she laughed. 3 months later, the news reached Aldridge Park. Lord Witmore had been utterly ruined. Evangeline learned of it through a letter from her younger sister Margaret, a frantic missive detailing the complete collapse of their father's remaining fortunes. Creditors had appeared from nowhere, demanding payment on debts the family hadn't known existed. Investments had soured. Mortgages had been called in. Within the space of a month, the Witmore family had gone from genteel poverty to absolute destitution. They had been forced to vacate Witmore Manor. They were living now in a cottage on a distant cousin's estate, dependent on charity for their very survival. Margaret's letter was a masterpiece of accusation and self-pity, blaming everyone from their father's associates to the government to Evangeline herself for abandoning the family to this fate. "You must do something," the letter concluded. "You are a duchess now. You have resources, connections, influence. You cannot simply sit in your great house in the north while your own family suffers. It is your duty to help us. It is your obligation." Evangeline read the letter 3 times before showing it to Benedict. "You did this," she said quietly. It was not a question. Benedict set down the book he had been reading and met her eyes. He did not try to deny it. "Yes." "When?" "I began acquiring your father's secondary debts shortly after our wedding. The process of calling them in was completed last month." His voice was calm, factual. "Every creditor who descended upon your family is, in fact, working for me. Every investment that soured did so because I arranged for it to fail. Your father's complete financial destruction was planned, orchestrated, and executed at my command." Evangeline felt herself begin to tremble, whether with anger or something else, she couldn't say. "Why?" "Because he sold you." Benedict's eyes had gone hard as flint. "Because he treated you as property to be disposed of. Because he never once considered your wishes, your feelings, your future, only his own convenience and comfort. And because I wanted him to understand, in the most visceral way possible, the consequences of his actions. My mother, my sisters, will be provided for." He rose and crossed to where she stood, taking her hands in his. "I have already made arrangements, anonymous charitable donations that will ensure their comfort without revealing my involvement. They will never want for necessities. They simply will not have the luxury and status that your father squandered." "You should have told me." Her voice came out strangled. "You should have consulted me before destroying my family. Would you have tried to stop me?" "I don't know." The tears came then, sliding down her cheeks. "Perhaps. Perhaps not. But I should have had the choice, Benedict. You keep making decisions that affect my life without ever asking what I want. First the surveillance, then the shrine. Now this. When does it end? When do I get to have some control over my own existence?" He was silent for a long moment. And when he spoke, his voice was rough with something that might have been shame. "You're right." The admission seemed to cost him. "I have spent so long planning around you that I've forgotten to plan with you. I treated you as a goal to be achieved rather than a partner to be consulted. It was wrong. I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't undo what you've done. No." He reached up to wipe the tears from her face. "But I can do better. Starting now, starting today, I can learn to include you in my decisions, to treat you as the partner you deserve to be, rather than the prize I spent 7 years trying to win." "And what about Ashton Fairfax?" Benedict's expression flickered. "What about him?" "Don't lie to me." Evangeline pulled back to look at him directly. "I know you, Benedict. I know how you think, how you operate. You wouldn't destroy my father and leave the man who mocked me publicly to go unpunished. What have you done to him?" The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken truths. Lord Fairfax has recently suffered a series of unfortunate business reversals, Benedict said finally. His investments in Northern Railways, the business he claimed brought him to our doorstep, have proven to be problematic. Several of the companies he invested in have collapsed. Others have been revealed as fraudulent operations that preyed on naive investors. You orchestrated the fraud? I exposed it, after ensuring that Fairfax was deeply invested in the relevant companies. His smile was sharp and satisfied. He won't be ruined, not completely. His family's holdings are too substantial for that. But his personal fortune has been decimated, his reputation for financial acumen destroyed, and his prospects for any advantageous marriage significantly diminished. Society will receive him, but they will whisper. They will laugh. They will call him the man who lost everything chasing after another man's wife. Evangeline stared at her husband, this brilliant, ruthless, utterly devoted man who had restructured the world around her. You should be horrified, she said slowly. Everything you've done, the surveillance, the manipulation, the destruction of people who wronged me, it's monstrous. It's the behavior of a villain, not a hero. I never claimed to be a hero. No. She stepped closer, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. But you're mine, for better or worse, in sickness and in health, until death do us part. And I find I don't want a hero, Benedict. I want a man who sees me, who chose me, who would burn down the world to keep me safe. Even if that man is a monster? Especially then. She kissed him, soft and fierce. Because I'm beginning to think I might be a monster too, and monsters belong together. The years that followed proved her right. Benedict learned, slowly, imperfectly, with setbacks and struggles, to share his life with his wife rather than simply possessing her. He learned to consult her on matters of the estate, to include her in his decisions, to treat her as the partner she had demanded to be. And Evangeline learned to love him, not despite his obsession, but because of it. Because there was something intoxicating about being wanted with that intensity, about being seen with that completeness, about being the center of another person's entire universe. They had 4 children over the course of a decade, twin boys named Edward and William, a daughter called Grace, and a late surprise they named Thomas, who arrived 7 years after Grace, when they had thought their family complete. Benedict proved to be a devoted father, as focused on his children as he had once been, focused solely on their mother. The blind Duke's deception was eventually revealed to society. It was impossible to maintain the fiction when Benedict began attending social functions with his wife, his seeing eyes tracking every detail of the world around him. There was scandal, of course. There were whispers and shocked, exclamations and matrons clutching their pearls at the audacity of such a prolonged deception. But society was fickle, and scandal was only interesting for so long. Within a few seasons, the Duke and Duchess of Aldridge were merely eccentric, reclusive perhaps, but wealthy enough that their eccentricities were tolerated, even admired. Their love story became romantic legend, embellished and exaggerated, until it bore little resemblance to the truth. No one knew about the shrine in the tower, which Benedict had dismantled on Evangeline's request. I don't need paintings and pressed flowers anymore, he had explained, as they packed the items away together. I have the real thing. No one knew about the destruction of Lord Witmore, who drank himself to death within 3 years of his ruin, or about the humiliation of Lord Ashton Fairfax, who never did marry and eventually retired to the continent in disgrace. No one knew the full truth of how the blind Duke had won his duchess, and that was exactly how they wanted it. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Benedict took Evangeline back to the tower room. It had been transformed in the years since she'd first seen it, no longer a shrine to obsession, but a beautiful sitting room with wide windows and comfortable furniture, where they could escape the demands of their household and simply be together. But one item remained from its previous incarnation, a small painting, no larger than a dinner plate, showing a 16-year-old girl in a white gown with blue ribbons in her hair. "I kept it," Benedict said, following her gaze. "I hope you don't mind. I couldn't bring myself to destroy it. That girl, that moment, she was the beginning of everything." Evangeline studied the painting, trying to remember the girl she had been, innocent, hopeful, completely unaware that across a crowded ballroom, a man was watching who would change her life forever. "I don't mind," she said. "But I do wonder sometimes. What would have happened if you hadn't seen me that night? If you had stayed home, or arrived late, or been distracted by something else? Then I would have seen you another night." Benedict came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Or the night after that. Or the one after that. I've thought about it often over the years, and I've concluded that it was inevitable. You and I were always going to find each other, Evangeline. The only variable was when." "That sounds rather like fate." "Perhaps it was." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Or perhaps I'm simply a man who saw a woman laugh and decided she would be his, and then moved heaven and earth to make it so. Either way, the result is the same. We ended up together. We ended up together." His arms tightened around her. "And I've been happy every day since, even the difficult days, even the days when you were angry with me, or I was frustrated with you, or we couldn't seem to agree on anything. I was still happy because you were there, because you chose to stay." Evangeline turned in his arms to face him. At 42, Benedict's dark hair had begun to show threads of silver at the temples, and lines had formed around his eyes that deepened when he smiled. He was no longer the coldly beautiful man who had knelt before her on their wedding night. He was something better, something warmer, something real. "I've never regretted it," she said. "Not for a moment, even knowing everything. The shrine, the surveillance, the calculated destruction of anyone who wronged me. I've never once wished I had made a different choice. Even though I'm a monster, even though." She rose on her toes to kiss him. "Because you're my monster, and I love you. I love you too." He said it easily now, those words that had once been so foreign to him. "I've loved you for 17 years, Evangeline. Loved you when I watched from a distance. Loved you when I plotted to claim you. Loved you every day of our marriage. And I will love you until I draw my last breath. And after? After, I will haunt you." His smile was wicked. "You don't think death will stop me, do you? I waited 7 years for you while I was alive. I'll wait an eternity for you once I'm dead." She laughed, the same laugh that had captivated him across a ballroom 17 years ago, still bright, still genuine, still the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. "Then I suppose I'll have to haunt you back," she said. "Fair is fair." "Fair is fair," he agreed, and kissed her again. Outside the tower windows, the sun was setting over Aldridge Park, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Below them, their children's laughter echoed up from the gardens where they played, watched over by nursemaids and governesses, and the vast machinery of a great estate. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was something better. Real. Messy. Complicated. Built on obsession and manipulation, and the slow, difficult work of learning to love each other as equals rather than as pursuer and prize. But it was theirs, and that was all that mattered. Dear listener, as you step away from this story, I wonder, have you ever been truly seen? Not glanced at, not assessed, not evaluated for what you might provide, but genuinely witnessed in all your complexity and contradiction. Has someone ever looked at you and seen not what you could do for them, but simply who you are? Benedict watched Evangeline for 7 years before she knew his name. He built a shrine to her from stolen moments and commissioned portraits. He dismantled his own life and constructed a prison of blindness, all for the chance to claim her. It was obsessive. It was invasive. It was, by any reasonable standard, deeply wrong. And yet he saw her, truly saw her, in a way that no one else ever had. He saw her laugh at a boy's terrible dancing and recognized something worth devoting a lifetime to. He saw her loneliness and her strength and her desperate desire to be more than just a decorative object to be traded between men. He saw her, and he loved what he saw so much that he was willing to become a monster to keep it. Perhaps that's not healthy. Perhaps that's not the kind of love we should aspire to. But for Evangeline, starved of attention in a world that saw her as nothing more than a commodity, it was exactly what she needed. Someone who would burn down the world just to see her smile. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? What time is it in your corner of the world? Leave a comment below. I read every single one, and your words remind me why these stories matter. Until next time, dear listener, may you find someone who sees you, and may you be worth the seeing. The end.